Hello and welcome to our latest LGIU interview where we sit down with local government leaders, chief execs and experts worldwide to gain insights into the sector. My name is Jon Gleek. I am Head of Research at LGIU. Today we are interviewing Orkney-based researcher Adele Lidderdale about her research and her PhD. Her thesis, The Scottish National Islands Plan, a roadmap for transformational change, explored the implementation of Scotland's 2019 National Islands Plan, examining the role of policy, networks and campaigns like Our Islands, Our Future in Scottish islands and politics. Welcome, Adele.
Thanks for that introduction, Jon.
So maybe just as a start, really, could you just please tell us a bit about yourself and your journey and your journey to studying a PhD on Scottish islands?
So I'm an Orcadian, or what we would locally call a local lass. I have lived and carried out my career here on the islands, particularly in Orkney, and I worked through various renewable development projects on the islands. They really were an excellent vector for communities to affect sustainable change in their areas. But often what we would find was that we would come up against legislative or regulatory barriers. So the journey through supporting these projects into implementation really led up to the policy in the end. So it was really a gift to be able to do this PhD research through the UHI with the support from the local authorities and yourselves at LGIU to have a really good look at islands policy.
That's great. What do you think kind of makes Scottish islands a really important case study for research?
I think with islands, what you have is this kind of distinct border around this governance unit. And with Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles, they each have their own unique governing arrangements. They have their unitary authority status. So in a sense, they've sort of developed their own ways of working and their own polity, having that kind of insular nature and that decision making for themselves. I think it's a really good advantage looking at the island governance. And we'll be touching it throughout the interview today, but there's something that we can learn from looking at these island-based governance models that can translate to the nation. And we also have had this relationship with European governance as well to support our communities and I guess our governance practice in general. So it kind of impacts wider communities. Some of the things we found, we'll see communities in other islands or other mainland areas that experience the same issues.
Well, I look forward to kind of hearing a bit more about sort of the lessons for other island communities, but I guess other local government in general. But I guess before we jump into all of that, maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your research and kind of what was involved and sort of what methods you used.
So I think it's really important to think about the Scottish Islands Act as being a bottom-up arrangement. So really, Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles tend to govern themselves. And what we saw through the Islands Scotland Act in 2018, it kind of kicked off a lot sooner than that. In 2013, we saw this really unique arrangement where Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles clubbed together to form this collaborative arrangement, which ultimately led to a change in legislation and the National Islands Plan framework and policy. So I think it was really interesting to look at that unique circumstance where we had this collaborative element, which was really a change in how things had worked. And also as the Islands Act started to come through and the National Islands Plan was published, suddenly there was a lot more international observance of what was happening on the islands as well. It was quite intriguing. And I think we're sort of seeing this policy trickle up. What's the opposite of trickle down? We're starting to see community wealth building, changes to empowerment acts and things like that in Scotland, and changing to governance arrangements in England as well. So I think it's been really intriguing to look at that unique circumstance. And what I found when I started to dig into the data, there was this programme for amassing quantitative data, looking at postcode data, looking at survey data, but the piece that was missing was really that qualitative aspect, which was actually provision for that was contained within the Islands Scotland Act itself. So asking islanders, asking those local authorities who were involved in developing the Act, how they were experiencing this change in policy. So I had a qualitative aspect, but I did have a quantitative aspect as well, and I was able to triangulate those two methods throughout my thesis journey.
I'm sure a PhD, and I'm sure your PhD, was a hugely in-depth piece of research, but I guess for the purposes of this interview and just to kick things off, if it's not an impossible question, I guess in summary, what were your main findings, or I guess what findings would you really want to highlight to an LGIU audience?
Sure, and I think that really participation in governance across different layers, from individuals, community groups, local authorities, up through the different civil servants and government, all the way up, to ministers. I think the participation is important, not just policy to achieve outcomes. I think what we've seen with the National Islands Plan is that where people are not feeling included in meaningful ways, it really does impact how successful the policy is going to be on the other end. So that process is extremely important. And actually, the inception, that idea of collaboration and centering around common problems was extremely effective for the islands in negotiating this kind of change in policy for them. And that really an understanding of policy, even though it's increasingly complex, is absolutely essential, because the policies drive investment, allocate resources, change structures and processes. They also offer an insight into future scenarios for your islands, or if you can sort of gather this sort of information about how decisions are going to be made. So I think it's really important that we get to grasps with policy and have that understanding of how it's going to impact us.
That's probably a great place to start, sort of going into the sort of findings in a bit more detail. So maybe if we start with sort of findings themselves for the Scottish Islands and sort of other islands, and then think about kind of beyond that, sort of other local government areas. So I guess just picking up on your final point you just made there, so that the sort of the National Islands Plan was created to help, and it was created to support islands, but many local councils felt that it hadn't delivered what it was originally asked for. What do you think were the biggest things sort of missing from this national policy?
I think about the local impact, what I saw across stakeholders. So I had 40 interviews with different local authority stakeholders, different community members involved with community groups. But I also had nearly 300 survey respondents from different islands at that individual level. And really, there was general agreement that the contents of the plan were good. Nothing could be added and nothing could be taken away. So it really was that process, that meaningful representation, that something had been missed in capturing how islands see themselves. So we call that in island studies islandness. That was the part that was kind of missing, rather than having to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. And I think, with such that strong start from the 3 island authorities working together, the local tier of governance I felt was maybe underutilised in the delivery of the National Islands Plan. And what we saw quite quickly was resources and funding from the Scottish Government going around local authorities directly into community groups. And I think what happens there is that as we're kind of through community wealth building, looking at exploring community organisations delivering more public services rather than this additionality, it opens up questions of where's the assessment of communities that are able to formalise around opportunities, and how do we address communities that are not able to formalise. And then I think there's this bigger question about the role of public services in general, and whether community groups should be delivering public services. That kind of came out where people were feeling, not meaningfully included, but that we were starting to see the use of community groups directly delivering programmes for the government without that overarching conglomerating factor of a local authority.
I know your sort of study found that power is actually becoming more centralised, and I guess you've sort of touched on that, particularly through sort of the early years of the plan. So how is that kind of more centralisation playing out on the ground for local authorities and for those island communities?
Yeah, there was this echoing theme throughout the research that the National Islands Plan was a plan for Scottish ministers to deliver. So even from the early inception of the local groups, suddenly we have this act and a plan, and it becomes the remit of government to deliver these changes rather than local authority. So we now have a legal document that describes what an island is, what an island community is. We have a National Islands Plan that set island priorities within that centralised process, and the budgets for this were set centrally also, and the communities delivering a lot of the projects were pre-selected by the government. So, a lot of it now is happening in-house in the government, that maybe traditionally would have been done at that local authority level.
So far we've talked about the islands as a group, but I'm sure that even within one island itself or an island group, there are different communities, and each of those communities will have different needs. So amongst all of that, how have councils sort of how have councils sort of balanced out those conflicting local demands, or kind of worked with different diverse communities?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because, yes, culturally the islands are different and each island has got different needs. But interestingly, I think when we take this public service lens, all islands are struggling with transport provision, housing provision, providing education, providing social care. So I think if we look at that public service level, actually, the profile of the islands, yeah, the numbers might be slightly different, but in terms of governance, what's needed to be required or delivered is quite similar. And I think, having that island voice to inform the decision making, the what's important to which island groups. Do they prioritise education? Do they prioritise transport? And I think it was really interesting looking at some of the statistics out at the end of the research that you can't just consider one public service, because there are public services that influence other public services. And I think a good case is when we have right now a lot of infrastructure works happening across the islands for these big energy developments, and we're needing to import a workforce. But when we do that, what we do is we put strain on transport, we put strain on local housing, we may put strain on local healthcare. So, it's one thing maybe building a school, but how are children going to access the school is, so there's this intimate link between public services where they sort of need to be considered in the round.
So you've already started to talk about sort of local stories and sort of local solutions that have really helped. I know that in your research you found that islands often come up with their own sort of clever ways to solve some sort of challenges that they're facing. I guess, have you got any examples that really sort of shine out from your research of a local solution that worked sort of better than the standard sort of government approach?
Yeah, and I think we can get bogged down in the problems, but I'm also one to think that we need to find the bottlenecks to be able to address them. So that's always my kind of starting point. And actually, even in the National Islands Plan programme, there was a really good example where, so we have obviously got the Shetland, Orkney and the Western Isles with their unitary authorities, and then we have other islands, Cumbrae, Arran, Argyll and Bute, that are associated with mainland authorities. And I think perhaps the strategy of collecting information about islands is sort of splitting off islands. So we're used to having an archipelago and having this identity of a group of islands, but the islands are kind of being parsed out. And I wonder if a better decision might be to recreate an archipelago for the islands that are associated with the mainland authority. So North Ayrshire had a really excellent senior officer that was placed in North Ayrshire Council that came up with an excellent strategic overview of the projects that they wanted to deliver, so that when funding materialised, they were able to act really quickly, the island groups, to identify funding for different projects. So really they had an excellent ability to get that per capita funding for their island groups by having that officer in place that kind of translated what the community wanted into how local authorities approach decision making, which I think was a great success. And then also things like addressing carbon neutrality. So there was a carbon neutral islands programme as part of the National Islands Plan, where 6 islands were doing a carbon audit and looking at projects that suited their islands to take forward into the future. And Cumbrae and Arran were really, really good at piecing together funding and developing solar programme, and really the carbon benefits were the side effect, and actually the home improvements and the cost reductions for the consumer were front and foremost. So there has been some really good examples of the agility that communities can have when they're allowed to take the project in a local direction, even though they've got that steer from the top. And I think that in both those cases there was really good alignment from the local level all the way up to what the national priority was. And I think that's kind of one of the missing pieces throughout this research, was the vision piece. What does a healthy island look like? How many people would live there? What types of industries will we be doing? And really, I think we've been so busy fighting fires that we don't really have this overarching umbrella of what a healthy island community might look like. So it makes alignment quite difficult, a bit more scattered.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. So I guess if I could ask you kind of one final question on that. From your research, did that come out as something that communities also felt, that they also didn't feel that there was a sort of a vision for their island and their communities? Or did they have a vision themselves and that wasn't articulated at a national level?
I think that's maybe more an analytical finding. But what I found was there was just lots of different projects, lots of different ideas about policy, lots of different people working in lots of different silos. And even with the government itself, I think, the National Islands Plan funding didn't necessarily match with the growth deal funding. So I think there was maybe opportunities for alignment even within that government level that didn't quite come to fruition in that first iteration of the National Islands Plan, as different departments tend to do their own thing.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always fascinating when you look at any local government case study, regardless of the context, actually how many connections there are to other places, even if, even from taking an island to a very dense sort of large city, there's still lessons and connections. So you've already touched on things like the relationship between the local and the central government, the role of community capacity building, and what that means for sort of improving community outcomes. So I always think it's fascinating when you look at one case study for local government, how applicable there are some sort of lessons for the wider system. So I wonder if it's worth kind of just sort of thinking about them now, about what you've learned from your research from islands and what that could mean for sort of local government contexts elsewhere, whether they're kind of other rural places or other sort of mainland areas, or maybe even completely different settings. So I guess your research really developed an understanding of good practice for community development. So what learnings do you think from your research that are sort of applicable to councils in other island communities to start off with, and across the UK and beyond?
Yeah, and I think part of it is that I asked one question at the end of my stakeholder interviews about what being an islander meant to the participant, and they found it really difficult to answer. And it's an identity. There's some politics of identity, and I know we can struggle into territory here that's, in the modern age, but actually it can have this positive impact where people felt kind of, in congruence with one another because they had this shared identity that was really quickly explained. I think we can sort of see this when looking at neighbourhood development, say in an urban region where there's, some distinct populations that live and are seeking to develop their kind of neighbourhood regions. And I think when I was working kind of in the community energy space, we would talk about islanded communities, so mainland communities that had similar problems with connectivity, transport, or digitisation. So there can be similar problems that we can learn from one another. So I think that was kind of one of the main things, that island is not just linked to our definition of being surrounded by the water at high tide. And actually, rural policy in the UK has always been a kind of looking glass for the UK government into how policy may be affected in other areas as well, because we tend to experience problems quite quickly, shall we say, because we're kind of at the end of our resilience kind of scale all the time. So if something does happen, we kind of get the side effects quite quickly. And we've seen that with things like, well, we had a moratorium on wind connections to the grid in Orkney in 2012, and we're now seeing that throughout the UK. And we're now seeing kind of governance models that the islands have had for decades, such as unitary authorities. Scottish local authorities then got unitary status in 1996. We're seeing an increase in things like independent councillors. That's always been our model of governance. So sometimes it's not that we're backwards, sometimes it's that we're a little bit ahead, but not necessarily out of, nous, but sometimes just out of circumstance. So I think it's that way that sometimes we're still seen as parochial, and a lot of the policy language is about resilience and community wellbeing, but actually there are pockets of knowledge that have come from this island governance model that can be useful in other contexts and in other governance landscapes as well. So I think there's lots of things there that islands can share outward.
It's really lovely to hear it, and it's really lovely to hear it sort of framed in that way. So for you, is there a kind of really important lesson or a sort of main set of lessons, sort of a mainland or another rural council can learn from the Scottish island experience in particular?
Yeah, I think when I was kind of communicating the research through conferences and things like that, we constantly were asked by other communities, how have you managed to do this? And I think that islands have been really good at keeping themselves, we all say making ourselves a bit of a nuisance, keeping the headlines in the media, because I think the way that we consider information as researchers is not necessarily what's important for governors or decision makers. The big headlines is kind of the things they want to avoid. So actually, by taking issues and making them publicly known and continuing to speak about them, I think that's been a really good asset for islands to keep their issues on the agenda. We've seen it over and over again with the kind of highly protected marine areas, island community impact assessments. They're not afraid to vocalise when they feel that they're not having the just desserts, if that makes sense. I think that's really, really important. And also just having that knowledge of the policy, where it's going and what the impacts are likely to be. And it's not just one policy. You know, you open one and there's a reference to 5 other policies and suddenly the network's huge. But it's just one of these things that has to be navigated. And it allows you to hold the decision makers to account in an extent, because, you know, they've said they're going to be doing this. So it's our job then to make sure that they're doing it. And really, you can do all that with policy work.
That's really interesting to hear. So I guess I'm interested in exploring that a little bit more, particularly in your answer to the previous question as well, around sort of language and how different communities are framed. So sort of what have you learned, and what do you think the learnings are for other places and contexts around how we describe particular communities? And do we use sort of asset-based language, or do we use kind of deficit-based language of sort of left behind places, or things like that? So I'm really interested in what your sort of take on that from your research and what it means for elsewhere.
Yeah, I think I just came across or started using, I use the term peripheralized because I see it as an active process. You know, we're not peripheral. And actually, there's a really interesting map that you can view if you look at it from an ocean's perspective, and our islands happen to be right in the middle. So it's this view of being peripheral, it's this idea of being peripheralized. And this did come across actually, particularly with the interviews with the local authorities, that, you know, our governing arrangements and our issues are very central to us, and that, you know, government in centres like Edinburgh or London is actually quite remote from us, from our worldview. So it is that language is extremely important. And I think it's really difficult for communities because they're now having to deliver services that are provided elsewhere. And I think as I talk about community infrastructure, and absolutely what we've really built up in the islands and what other rural areas have is they have really proficient community development groups that are able to attract funding, that are able to manage complex projects. But where that was additional things, it's now housing projects. It's now delivering, you know, energy coupons to people who are struggling to afford, you know, to pay their electricity bill. Sometimes it's managing access to internet. We've had a few islands who have no internet just this week, you know, are relying on satellite broadband and things like that. So I think where we see this as a positive, I think we really have to think about how we're going to support that community infrastructure, because I recently read a great article about a programme in Glasgow that supports migrants to the city to settle in. And she was discussing running this community trust as a policy failure from the government. So what we are seeing as a positive asset in another setting is seen as a policy failure. And I think as long as there's support and funding, that's great. But where those things start to withdraw and the communities are relying on, you know, reduced funding pots and increased delivery of public services, I think we really need to kind of be careful about how we approach that. And you know, it's not negative, but it's a really positive asset, but it needs to be managed well. And I think, like I mentioned right at the beginning, the ideas about gaps, what communities are not able to provide, you know, what's going to be in place there to ensure, you know, this equality of public service provision, I think is really important.
Yeah, thank you. That's really interesting to think of it in that way. You mentioned right at the beginning around the sort of the quantitative and the qualitative. So I wondered how that would sort of play out when you think kind of broadly around kind of well-being and quality of life. And I'd be interested in what you learned about sort of measuring well-being throughout this process, and sort of what approaches work well when there's kind of a huge range of both sort of statistical and a lot more sort of rich community evidence and data out there.
Yeah, I think, you know, well-being is quite, when we think about community development term, it's quite intimately connected with public service provision, with access to education, access to the natural environment, access to work, you know, fair pay and things like that. So really the public services are essential, particularly in places, rural places or island places, where often there just isn't a private firm that can provide a service. We really rely on the public services. But wellbeing is interesting because it's both subjective and objective. So what we have in the islands, and particularly in my island of Orkney, is that we have often got the highest rates of happiness and people enjoying where they live. and these really high self-reported view of well-being. But there was a recent report that came out from the Highlands and Islands that showed that rural and island areas in Scotland were below international human rights standards across a variety of well-being indicators, such as, jobs and things. So on paper, is not matching up with what people say. So I think it's really this balance about, the objective measures and the subjective measures, and it's about that process, and not being afraid to kind of adjust metrics if to help make decisions for islanders. But we still have high rates of isolation. We have high rates of kind of suicide compared to elsewhere. So it's not all rosy, but it's just a really interesting, it's not a linear connection.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess through your research, but just generally how do you square that circle if you've got sort of one set of evidence that sort of says one thing, another set of evidence that sort of says another thing? Like how have you rationalized and sort of synthesized that, and what does that mean for those sort of communities and beyond?
I think, even in my quantitative survey, I still had space for survey members to explain their answers basically. And it's where you get the really rich data when you do qualitative research, and it does take time and it's much more complex. It's definitely not the easy option when you've got a statistic. It's amazing, you can look at it, but like I say, there's sometimes these kind of interplays that are not quite linear. So people kind of explaining, why they've said something, and again, it's really the process. Sometimes you can have exactly the same input and output, but if people don't feel they've been taken along on that journey, it can alter how people feel about the output, whether it's different or not. So that subjective bit, I think, shouldn't be squashed. I think we should embrace asking and speaking and having that process. And in some ways it can be old-fashioned, but sometimes coming round on those old skills can be a really good way of navigating forwards as well.
Definitely. So thinking about sort of what you touched on at the beginning, really, what have you learned about the dynamics between sort of the centre or national government and local communities? And I know that's a big question that you think is relevant for other contexts.
I think it's really tempting, especially as things get complex, especially as resources become more scarce, to centralise, because it makes decision easier in a way. But I think often then the decisions are not so well accepted, and actually the efficiencies sort of diminish over the other side when people are not happy with the outcomes. And I think, like I mentioned before about the localism, I think especially at that local authority level, and living in the community and knowing full well that local authorities, particularly in the islands, they bear a lot of the brunt of decision making that they have very little control over, because they're the kind of local face of governance. But actually, I think really for a local authority to support could actually provide, information about what gaps need to be filled. They're kind of used to making decisions in that local area. But I think, it's that struggle to navigate the diminishing resources and start having to choose between different services. We talked about well-being, they're really kind of stuck in that place. So I think we really need the layers, and we need that conversation to flow between the layers as well, because that's what we didn't see in the National Islands Plan. There was kind of like there was not really much communication between the government and local authorities, really, and that really did kind of stifle its outcomes. And I think that one of my survey questions was kind of asking how people, not what they decided, but how they participated in various democratic acts. So I asked about people participating in consultations throughout national, Scottish Government and local level, and people were more likely to vote in national elections, but they were more likely to participate in consultations at that local level. And I think that tells us something about how people want to participate, but also how we can use that infrastructure to support better decision making. So it seems that people think that local authorities is the best way to interact with the actual end of decisions. And I think that vision piece should come from that national level. So it's not one or the other, but I think that they need to be able to, influence each other a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. It's really great to hear you sort of articulating in such a complex thing and such a sort of tight and simple way. And I'm sure people listening to this in other places, other aside of islands, that will really resonate when they're thinking about that sort of dynamic between the sort of the local and the national, because those sorts of tensions play out absolutely everywhere. So you mentioned sort of democratic engagement and the sort of our democratic systems, but I guess we've mostly talked about sort of the here and now. So I wonder if it's worth thinking sort of just as we close this off about the future. So looking ahead, is there one change that you would sort of want to see, or do you really think that we really need to develop on, whether that's sort of democracy or democratic infrastructure or wider sort of local government reform? Anything that we want to really focus in on to sort of ensure that local government stays strong for the next 10 years?
I think reflecting on this, during my stakeholder interview process, I interviewed dozens of extremely knowledgeable, caring, competent local decision makers that were more than qualified to make the decisions. They had decades of experience in delivering governance at the local area, thinking right back to the inception of the National Islands Plan, when they were able to focus on commonalities and foster collaboration without being forced necessarily. That relationship became extremely important. So that's that social capital aspect, that trusting relationship, where they were able to then amplify the issues in ways that were picked up by Scottish Government and ultimately by the UK Government to enact change. So the relationship, the trusting relationship, and I think throughout the plan, there was much more use of competitive funding bids where communities were kind of pitted against one another to bid in. And that kind of comes at the local authority level. But actually, that kind of diminishes that collaborative element, which is really important for bringing about innovation and change and shared learning. So I think that was really important. And I think that the communication aspect, it's not often taken seriously, but it really has important supportive role to play. And I think that happens at local governance level as well. Often the local government will do something brilliant, but the feedback loop hasn't continued. So people pay in, then they think, oh, I've just done these consultations and my advice hasn't been taken, but we never actually disseminate the process. And I think we are getting better at that, but allowing people to know that how they've played their part has really informed what's happened is really, really important. And I think it will repair relationships between citizens and their institutions, because much as we love to gripe about them, they are really a stabilising force in our lives.
Absolutely. I think that's probably a great point to sort of to finish on. Thank you so much, Adele. It's been really great to hear about your PhD and the research you've done over the years. It's always fascinating to hear about the case studies of the islands and the research and the importance of that work. It's also just as interesting to hear about the applicability of the lessons for sort of other local government contexts. So I'm sure watchers of this video from all sorts of jurisdictions will sort of taken loads from what you've had to say. So Adele, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your experiences and insights with LGIU. Thank you to everyone for listening, and stay tuned for more LGIU interviews. Thank you.